As you can see in the screen, from Madrid to Vilnius, the war in Ukraine, and the future of NATO. And it's really, I'm very glad to be here opening this seminar. Well, I didn't say, but I am José Juan Ruiz, chairman of the Real Instituto Elcano. Let me, first of all, to thank our speakers for coming to Madrid. And of course, thanks to NATO for supporting this conference and for its partnership. Last year, we had a very intense and great cooperation with NATO in the way to the organizing the public forum that we have in Madrid in parallel with the NATO meeting of Chief of States. And we are eager to continue this cooperation through years and through events like this that we are open today. But also, we want also to cooperate with NATO, public diplomacy, and of course Lithuania, confirming that El Real Instituto Elcano is going to be present in the upcoming public forum in Vilnius next month. We will then be there, and we will be very happy to try to help with our experience and our network, and of course our platform to distribute whatever you need to make Vilnius a very great success. And I'm completely sure that this is going to happen. I am also very happy to see today here some colleagues from the Eastern European Study Center who will be playing a key role in this year NATO Public Forum, and from CES, which is a key partner for El Real Instituto Elcano. I might say that, as you all know, there has been a significant increase in public interest of NATO in Spain. You can remember that our referendum some 25 years ago to remain in NATO was just approved by 51% of support. And the last poll that we have realized, we have made in Spain, we have 87% of people supporting NATO, which is really a very long chain in the way in which the Spanish society look at the NATO, look at the defense, what it really means, and this joint effort of democracies to support and to defend human rights. Of course, this large increase in support to NATO has a lot to do with the terrible war that is happening in Ukraine, the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, and this has reminded the Spanish society and the European society the importance of NATO and, of course, the importance of the transatlantic relationship. Also, has reminded us the importance of not taking our security in defense for granted. We have to work on that. And this is what explains why we are so involved as Real Instituto Elcano in this joint effort. I am very happy we are organizing this event to continue to reflect on NATO's road from Madrid to Vilnius, and the broader challenge of investing in defense and the strategic, industrial, economic payoffs of doing so. I think this, to bring more than narratives, to bring numbers, to bring evidence, to bring commitments to the debate is extremely important, because we are not just think tanks. We are citizens worried about what is going on around us and ready to defend our way of looking at life and democracy. I see we have a packed program today, so I will not take more time from you and from my dear panelists. I would like to thank all of you and all the speakers and all of you for coming along. And I will give the floor to Ángeles Moreno, which is the Spain's State Secretary for Global and Foreign Affairs, who will deliver the introductory remarks. Ángeles, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, José Juan. And thank you to the entire team of Elcano for organizing this event with the Public Diplomacy Division of NATO. It is a key opportunity to review the program we launched in Madrid with the strategic concept for the next decade and the progress that has been made this year. Now that we have Vilnius coming, and we wish all the best, obviously, to the colleagues who are in charge to organize this key summit. We find ourselves in a scenario of tension and competition that comprises military, political, economic, technological, environmental, and humanitarian challenges, and we are facing them together with our NATO allies. The Madrid summit in June 2022 was key for the alliance adaptation to a new and more demanding security context. And it was the first summit we organized after Russia's aggression against Ukraine. At a time when NATO had been declared in brain death, we saw the resurrection of NATO, the revitalization. In terms of membership, we have one new member and one new member hopefully adhering in Vilnius, Finland and Sweden. We have new financial commitments to NATO and to our security and defense. These means that we have also an opportunity to invest in innovation, in job creation, as the defense industry is mainly based on innovation and job creation. So this gives us a new framework to boost our compromise to our defense. And we launched also a new strategic concept, which, as I said, is valid for a decade. A new strategic concept that has at its center, obviously, the war in Ukraine as our main concern, but not only that. And I will have the opportunity now to review the main issues that were at stake in Madrid and that will keep on being at stake in the new concept, strategic concept that will be launched, or the revision of the concept that will be made in Vilnius. As I said, Ukraine is at the core of our concern now in our discussions on security. And what we've been doing this year has been supporting Ukraine in lethal equipment out of NATO. We have created this Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the Rammstein Group, which has allowed us to provide Ukraine with lethal material, but out of NATO. And we've been doing this, Spain has been doing this on a bilateral basis, but also through the European Peace Facility from the European Union. NATO's support to Ukraine has been channeled through the comprehensive assistance package that had been set in 2016, together with the Trust Fund, to support Ukraine's security and defense sector reform. And in the aftermath of the Russian aggression, last year in Madrid, we approved an enhancement of this cap in order to provide non-lethal assistance in the short term and in the long term, a preparation of post-war reconstruction and reform. In this new NATO summit in Vilnius, we will be again addressing an enhancement of the cap, and we will also be addressing the definition of the future relationship we want to have with Ukraine in its political and practical dimensions. Military and practical support will keep on being a priority. But as I say, these will be still channeled on a bilateral basis or through the Rammstein group. Vilnius will include an enhancement, to summarize, of the comprehensive action package and a multi-year program to help Ukraine move towards a new standard, far from the Soviet standard, Soviet era standards they had, doctrine and equipment. We are also supporting the establishment or the evolution of the NATO-Ukraine Commission into a more political NATO-Ukraine Council. And this is being discussed now. We consider that one of the key solutions that we have found to face Russia's aggression on Ukraine has been unity, and because we want to keep on being united, we need to find a consensus on every decision we take. So we are now working towards this NATO-Ukraine Council, and it is still being negotiated to find this consensus, as this is, as I say, our most powerful tool. The Russian aggression has also obliged us to enhance our deterrence and defense posture in the eastern flank. And this was established so in the Madrid strategic concept, and in the extraordinary meeting that took place also in 2022, leaders agreed to deploy 4 battalions in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, in addition to the 4 already present in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. We've been reinforcing our eastern flank, and we plan that decisions in Vilnius will also reinforce regional plans and force requirements in the eastern flank. Spain has shown its commitment to the eastern flank. We've been deploying NASAM's air defense system together with 100 troops in MR base in Estonia, and a new deployment is expected in Estonia for a period of 4 months from August to December in the context of the air policing in the Baltic Sea. We are the second contributor to the enhanced forward presence in Latvia with 620 troops, and we participate also in the air policing in the Black Sea. As I said, one of the key results of the aggression of Putin on Ukraine has been also the increase in our financial compromises. And in Madrid we decided also a new defense investment pledge that went far beyond what we had assumed in ways in 2014. The compromise to reach 2% of the GDP. This stood as one of the main deliverables of the Madrid summit, and now we expect the Vilnius summit to go far beyond these 2%, not necessarily in terms of percentage of the GDP, but in taking into account also the components of the pledge, the cash contributions and capabilities that each country is compromising and committing to the common defense. In Spain, we agreed to reach this 2% GDP in 2029, and we have been seeing already this year substantial increases in our defense budget. Apart from Ukraine, there have been other of Ukraine in the center of this new strategic concept. There have been other areas, other regions considered as key to be signalized. One is the Indo-Pacific area. In fact, what we agreed was to establish a 360 degrees approach in that Madrid strategic concept. The Indo-Pacific countries have been at the core of our common foreign policy in NATO. This is why they were present in Madrid during our summit. And they will be also present in Vilnius as key like-minded countries, because we are clear that we need to partner with those countries who share our values and our firm commitment to defend the rule of law, the international rule of law. These four countries that were in Madrid, Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand, have kept on working with us very closely last year in terms of practical cooperation in innovation, maritime security, cyber and hybrid threats, among others. And they will be also at a high level political representation in Vilnius, I understand. Other partners that have been in the core of our policy last year have been partners at risk because they are threatened by the pressure from Russia. We have Moldova and Georgia, who have been at the center of our attention lately, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I understand that the idea is to have them also with a special attention in Vilnius. Apart from these areas, we have been also pledging our compromise to new financial and innovation instruments, like the Diana Innovation Accelerator Organization and the Innovation Fund that was already agreed in Madrid. We are trying to invest more in innovation and in our military capabilities. The goal is for Diana to reach its initial operational capacity in the Vilnius summit. And there are already 22 allies working in the innovation fund that was approved in Madrid. Another area which is key for Spain, and in fact we were the main promoter of its introduction into the new strategic concept last year, is the Sahel. It is key to pay attention to our southern neighborhood in Europe. This has been agreed not only in NATO. This is the key center of attention now of the coalition against Daesh, for instance, or the Aqaba process, which last meeting took place yesterday in Cordoba. As we have realized that there is an increasing threat of jihadism and terrorism in the Sahel, all kinds of traffic of human beings, of weapons, of drugs. Climate change is a great accelerator of insecurity in the Sahel. Countries, broken countries like Sudan are also an accelerator to this instability. And the increased presence of Russia in the form of Wagner in countries like Mali are obviously great threats in our southern flank. We agreed in Madrid to have a comprehensive approach with our partners to this area. We all are clear that we need to combine development policies and security policies. And what we expect also from Vilnius is to have a clear strategy being designed to be able to put in place this comprehensive and pragmatic approach to the southern flank. And I understand that this is the work we will be carrying out during next year. NATO and the European Union are two key partners. That was also visible during the Madrid meeting. And as 23 members of the alliance are members of the European Union, at least when Sweden will access the alliance, and cooperation between NATO and the European Union is not an option. It is key that we avoid duplications and competition. We have the strategic compass in NATO that is also foreseeing an increase in our investment in the industry of defense, and we need to make sure that our capacities and capabilities can be interoperable. Unity is key, unity between the members of NATO, the members of the European Union, and all the alliance who want to preserve this international order based in rules. And finally, the new strategic concept approved in Madrid put also a focus on the women, peace and security agenda that will also be at our discussions in Vilnius, climate change as an accelerator of instability, and human security. And I am sure that the Vilnius Summit will help us develop all our policies, and that you will have a very successful meeting in Vilnius. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luis Simon, the director of Elcano's office in Brussels. Thanks to the State Secretary for kicking us off and to our chairman for the introduction. Let me now introduce our next two speakers who will deliver opening remarks, and then we'll move into a panel conversation. And as you may have gathered, we may run slightly over time this afternoon. Let me first introduce our good friend Javier Colomina, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy at NATO. Javier.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thanks very much, José Juan. Thanks very much, Elcano, for organizing this event, and thanks very much to the panelists as well for being here. So, as the Secretary of State mentioned, February 22nd was a date where security in Europe was shattered, and in my view, for many years, the international relations and the European security architecture was changed. Madrid was going to be a very remarkable summit because we all knew already at the time that we were going to approve a strategic concept, and that is the basic document that we have for a decade or even more. But of course, it was a landmark and a historical one because of the beginning of the war in February of that year. I would mention just a couple of things that, in my view, made the summit fundamental. I will go into Ukraine, of course, but I will say a couple of things on the strategic concept, which sets our policies, in particular with regard to the current geostrategic competition, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, geostrategic competition that was shaping for the last years, and since February 2022, it's absolutely with us, and we need to actually approach the international relations having that in mind. And the concept defines our policy with regard to the two threats that we have approved. Russia, which is the most immediate threat, and terrorism, which is the most asymmetric threat. As the Secretary of State mentioned, we were yesterday, actually, both of us in Cordoba together with King of Spain and King of Jordan participating in the Aqaba process, which is about terrorism, and particularly in this case about the Sahel. But it also defines a policy on China. Let me just make a brief parenthesis on that. NATO has a quite complex and sophisticated policy with regard to China. We have decided that China is not an adversary, but China represents a systemic challenge because it presents many security challenges for all of us. That doesn't mean that the alliance is not a regional alliance. The alliance is a regional alliance. We are here to protect Euro-Atlantic stability. But it's very clear to all of us that many of the challenges that we see today, cyberspace, hybrid, you name it, do not have any more a geographical basis. And therefore, we need to prepare ourselves for that. Therefore, we are working on how to be more resilient, on how to protect better our supply chains, on how to work whenever we see that some of the challenges that could come to us, could affect us directly. It was quite clear during COVID times how some of the supply chains, how the fact that we've been selling our critical infrastructures to Chinese investors could affect us and could affect our security. Therefore, we decided to work on that, to make a clear-eye assessment on where we were on China, which doesn't mean that China is an adversary. And at the same time, I want to put some emphasis on that, we preserved the engagement track of our relationship with China. Myself, I do have interaction with my Chinese counterparts all the time. It's a very transparent and blunt interaction where we actually tell them very openly, I do tell them very openly how disappointed we are, for instance, with their position they have decided to take on Russia's war against Ukraine. Then Madrid was, of course, a defining moment in terms of how the international community was going to react to Russia's war against Ukraine. I do remember, I think it was the day after, a couple of days after, we had the first summit at the heads of state level in Brussels to see how we were going to react to Russia's war against Ukraine. And one of the presidents present there said that it was going to be very difficult to sustain unity in the long haul, since the consequences of the war were going to be very asymmetric. At the time already, we had hundreds of thousands at the time, now it's millions of refugees in Poland, and we had other nations that weren't affected at all because of the geographical distance, for instance. Well, I think NATO was fundamental in two aspects with regard to the war. First of all, which is, in my view, probably one of the most important tasks that NATO has been implementing in its 70, almost 5 years of life, which is to prevent that a local war, as terrible as it is, do not become a global one. To do that, we had to increase, to strengthen our defense and deterrence effort. And we moved away from our policies since the end of the Cold War to policies where we were going to have more forward presences, which doesn't mean a permanent forward presence, but means an enlarged and a stronger presence in the eastern flank. The Secretary of State mentioned the number of battle groups. We also decided to be able to scale up those battle groups to brigade level, and we decided to create a new force model, which is basically the way we generate force to make it more ready and easy to be used. I will go back to that. The second thing was how we've been instrumental, in my view, of course I represent NATO today, in being able to channel the unity. I don't think the international community would have been able to sustain the efforts at the bilateral level if there was no unity at the group level. And I think NATO was instrumental in that. We used the platform to create that sense of necessity that is now not only among our heads of states and among our governments, but also among our societies. And I would say that at the beginning we all thought it was going to be difficult to sustain that level of unity within our societies. And of course there is a level of social unrest, there is levels of energy prices going on, inflation, we all know about that. But at the end of the day, I believe that the support to Ukraine has been accepted by our societies. We'll see for how long, but I think we've been able to do a quite good job on that. And finally, Finland and Sweden, we signed the historical agreement. The trilateral agreement in Madrid was signed. The mechanism was created. We had, all of us, high hopes that Finland and Sweden were going to become members very soon. It wasn't at the end that soon. Finland already entered, and we all hope that Sweden will be the next to come. A truly historic event, as I said, that will be followed by a Vilnius summit. That should also be a landmark event, because we need now to take the decisions to implement the decisions taken in Madrid. And as we all know, implementation sometimes is the toughest piece of all. On deterrence and defense, as I said, I was going to say a few words more on that. I cannot reveal everything we do because it's very highly classified, but on defense and deterrence, at the end, we are clearly changing our own collective defense construct. We have decided to approve regional plans for the first time. We will be working on a new forces structure. That's the new force model I mentioned before. I'm going to give you a figure. In the first 15 days since the war started, only 15 days, NATO was capable to mobilize 40,000 troops, 300 aircrafts, and 100 ships. That was in 15 days. It's quite impressive in my view. I don't think anyone could do that right now in the world. With this new force model that we are working on, assigning forces regionally, the idea is to be able to move in that same period of time 300,000 troops, more than 1,000 aircraft, and more than 300 ships. We are not deploying that kind of force as we did in the Cold War, when we had deployed hundreds of thousands of troops. We are just being able to do that at a very high readiness, which is, of course, a lot to ask. We will need to reinforce what we call in military terms command and control, and we will need, of course, to have a very, very sophisticated alert system that helps us to move from one level to the other. To do all of it, we need money, and we will need more resources, and that's the deep discussion that we are going to have in the next days. NATO wants to move from the famous 2%, which was the ceiling we had up to now, to 2% as a floor, and therefore we are recommending our allies, we understand it's quite difficult, to approve a new dip where the 2% will be the minimum required. On Ukraine, as I mentioned, it's going to be a priority in Vilnius. We are, as we speak, working on the different aspects of our relationship with regard to Ukraine. Secretary of State mentioned how we can move from a NATO-Ukraine Commission to a NATO-Ukraine Council. That basically means in a council, the 31 allies and Ukraine will be sitting on an equal footing and take decisions, all of them as members. So it's actually a quite step up of our political relationship. We are also working on a long-term package of support through the comprehensive assistance package, but one that will probably take years and with an amount per year. And we're also working and discussing today on how we can give a certain level of satisfaction to the Ukraine desires of accession and membership. Something that is not going to happen while the war is on. The Ukrainians understand that, but we will need to find a consensus on how we can respond to the Ukrainians. That is a piece of work that will come into the political declaration of the summit that will be approved on the day of the summit, and negotiations will start in a week's time, and I have the honor of chairing those negotiations. Not going to be easy, but we all hope for the best. Then on partners, AP4 will be represented again in Vilnius. We're working on them very well. I already spoke about China. Our relationship with our four Indo-Pacific partners is a positive agenda. Actually, if you look into the documents we have with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, China is not mentioned at all. We work on a positive agenda on the things that are a concern for them. Of course, we can all imagine that China is underlying everything we do with these four nations, but it is a positive agenda, not an agenda that is being worked against China. It's very important to mention that. We will work on our vulnerable partners, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, and Moldova, as was mentioned before. And I like to say a word on the South. I think the South is claiming relevance, and NATO is given that relevance to the South lately. It was very prominent in Madrid, and it's going to be prominent again in Vilnius, and in my view, it's going to be even more prominent in our next summit in Washington in 2024, where we will be celebrating the 75th anniversary of NATO. We believe that the South is particularly relevant in the geostrategic competition that I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, the battle of narratives that we all see. I do travel quite a lot to southern partners, and it's important to talk with them, to convince them not to take sides, not at all, but just to do as much as they can do to help in our common endeavors. Of course, they have foreign policy boundaries, different priorities. We need to respect those. But within those boundaries, there is always common ground, and we should look into that, and we should work with our partners to get that. Finally, just a word to end up with Sweden. We were actually, all of us, expecting to have Sweden already inside the alliance, and we have high hopes that it could happen, it would happen as soon as possible, and we all hope for the best that is going to happen in Vilnius. It's not in my hands or in the hands of my Secretary General, but we will continue to do our best to do it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Javier. You put a lot of great points on the table. We'll follow up on many of those. Let me now welcome Ambassador Matulianis, who is the permanent representative of Lithuania to NATO, to discuss his country's main priorities ahead of the Vilnius summit. Ambassador, welcome.
Dear State Secretary, dear Jaime, dear ambassadors, dear colleagues, it's really a great pleasure to be here with you. And I will start by saying it's a good logo from Madrid to Vilnius, because actually 2021 we had an agreement with Spanish ambassador Miguel at that time, and because we both wanted to have a summit in 2022, that let's do it, 2022 in the south and 2023 in the east. And we did that, and we agreed between ourselves, and we supported each other, and at the end we have this, historical, I would say historical, geographical summits, because in Madrid we had a historical, and I agree with Jaime, and I hope that in Vilnius will be also historical, since we have a lot of very important subjects when the war is raging in Ukraine, and it's our duty. And again, it's a symbol of our determination to devote all our efforts to 360-degree approach. And in this respect, I would like also to agree with State Secretary that security is a top priority for all of us. It's the highest possible value for our life and for the life of any state. And therefore, my first president said at the beginning of our independence, when we tried to join European Union and NATO, and this is already a known statement, that NATO is for life, EU is for better life. This is a short description how we consider NATO and the European Union. Both are very important, and we are really very supportive, and 80% and more than 80% support both EU and NATO. And also I would like in this respect to commend Spain. As far as I'm already 3 years as ambassador of Lithuania in NATO, and I must admit that Spain is one of the biggest contributors in the eastern flank. And you mentioned some, but I feel this determination to continue and even to increase Spanish contribution. I'm not speaking about, there are some ideas, probably it will be too early to disclose what Spain is going to do, but in principle, you have been many times taking rotation in air policing in Lithuania. I lost already the number, but probably top 2, 3, I'm among the top 2, 3 countries. And also your contribution in air defense, as you already mentioned, also contribution in Latvia, and hopefully in some other countries. And also we also understand very well, with the time passing, importance to concentrate not only on our region, but on the south. 2021 we witnessed what could happen. I mean, you remember the migration crisis, migrants coming from the south and entering Lithuanian, Polish and Latvian border. This is one point. And also terrorism and drug trafficking and destabilization. This is really a danger coming from the south, and Russia is also present. They are trying to help us in this sense. And I would like also, when speaking about Vilnius summit, I hope unity is important, but unity should be combined with resolve. Imposed unity, it's not the best point. We have to reach agreement, and this agreement should be, acceptable to all, or how to say, not acceptable to anything, to anyone, because we need to have a compromise. And I have, in principle, when we speak about Vilnius summit, there are two very evident priorities: deterrence and defense, and Ukraine. I will not dwell into other areas which are also important, but I will concentrate on these two. First of all, deterrence and defense. Well, a war in Ukraine has shaken the alliance policy. We have been working more on partnerships, on dual track approach, dialogue, and there was a period when it was not very fashionable to speak about collective defense. Only we, Easterners, so-called Easterners, spoke about necessity to have a stronger collective defense approach. And now we see there is a shift towards collective defense. As Jaime said, towards forward defense. Forward defense means that the alliance has to protect the territory of the alliance from the first minute of the invasion. A so-called concept of deterrence by punishment or retake the territories. It's not acceptable to us. We see what is happening in Ukraine, in Bucha, and all the massacres. And therefore, we have a very important, qualitatively new deterrence and defense system, which is now elaborated, and regional plans probably the most important of it. And we need to have combat-ready forces in all domains, sea, land, and air, and also well-established and functioning command chain, and forces ready to defend alliance territory immediately. And then in Madrid we decided, also this is for us very important issue, to scale up in battle groups to brigade-size units. And it relates to, in our view, we understand this as a permanent rotational stationing. And we need to move forward, and we have our partners Germany, but we still have some discussions with them how to implement that. If we emphasize only reinforcement, then this decision is not really relevant, because the decision in Madrid was to have in-place forces in peacetime, not in crisis situations. And this is for us extremely important and very sensitive issue, and I hope that next week we will see some movement on that, and because Germany is a very important partner and we don't want to discuss with them for a long time. But please understand, Lithuania, country which is squeezed between Kaliningrad region in the west and Belarus, you know what is happening in Belarus in the east, and having a very specific vulnerable geographical spot, Suwalki corridor. From this Suwalki corridor depends the whole, reinforcement of the Baltic region. It's very easy to cut this with small forces, using several brigades to cut access to the whole Baltic region. And therefore, forces in place are important. Reinforcement cannot replace that. And therefore, this is really very important position. We are going to defend it. And then Sweden. Sweden, it's not issue of solidarity. Sweden is issue of deterrence and defense. And we speak with Turks from time to time. You are raising your security concerns. Please also understand our security concerns. Swedish membership is important for us, for our security. And there are a lot of reasons. Across the Baltic Sea, 200 kilometers, we have Sweden. And with Swedish membership, we will get additional, strategic depth. We will get additional, as I said, possibilities to reinforcement of allied forces. And also the Baltic Sea will be completely, NATO sea. And therefore, we appeal all the time to Turks. It's not a question of simple political solidarity. It's a question of security of your ally. One for all and all for one. And this principle should be also relevant to us. And I hope that still we have some time. And of course, it would be a disaster if we would not be able to accept Sweden in Vilnius. And Sweden has already delivered everything, and it's already acknowledged by all allies. And it's important to move forward on that. Well, this is deterrence and defense package. Then Ukraine. Ukraine is equally a sensitive issue. I hope that at the end of the day we will reach a compromise on this, but we need to move forward from Bucharest decision towards Vilnius decision, which should be more ambitious and which should open the pathway of membership to Ukraine. Nobody is speaking that Ukraine will be admitted or invited in Vilnius to become member of NATO. But just, repeating the same hollow statements, it's not good. We need to have a much stronger position, and it should be, as I said, we need to create a clear pathway, regular assessment of the readiness of Ukraine to become a member of NATO. And there are some ideas which are already floating. We accept all the ideas of Secretary General in this respect. And we also need to increase practical support. Practical support, it's a broad definition. Those, ideas of security assurances, they're in principle assurances of practical support. It's not security guarantees. Security guarantee is one, it's Article 5. And therefore we consider only in this respect, and it should help Ukraine to become a NATO member, but it should not be a replacement of NATO membership. And also practical support when it comes to non-lethal support. I think NATO is doing a lot, and I hope that we will have this multi-annual support program approved. NATO-Ukraine Council upgrade, political upgrade, institutional upgrade. By the way, this idea is idea presented by 7 Eastern European countries in March, and we are really thankful that it was accepted as one of the step forward. And why we are so stubborn on Ukraine? Because we think that we should. Membership of Ukraine will de-escalate situation. Some countries are saying that the membership of Ukraine will escalate situation. Please believe us that we also, joined NATO, and there were some discussions, not defensible countries, maybe we should not do it. It's an area of Russian interests, and we should not leave gray zone. If we leave it, then of course Russia will try again, and then Ukraine will be, as Timothy Snyder said, bloodland forever. And we need to help, and this is we need a courage in this respect. And of course, at the end of the day, probably we will find a compromise, and I'm convinced that it's possible. And defense investment pledge, we need to invest more into defense. But as I said, also I accept this argument of Spain. You are contributing a lot, and this has to be also taken into account. And but 2% as a floor should be also a rule which should be, accepted to all of us. Of course, we would be more ambitious because we spent already 2.5% of GDP to defense, and without proper resources, it would be very difficult to implement this new system of regional plans, and also to replenish stocks of ammunition we are delivering to to Ukraine. Well, I think I will stop here. So already time is passing so fast. Thank you very much. And let's have, after historical summit in Madrid, historical summit in Vilnius. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador and Javier and Madam Secretary, for kicking us off. We're now moving into a roundtable format where we'll hopefully unpack many of the issues that were raised during our opening segment. We've got about 50 minutes left, and there should be time for taking some questions from the audience. We also have an online audience. As we've heard over the last year and a half or so, the question of how to support Ukraine has been a top priority for the alliance. And there's an intense debate these days, as was reflected in the opening segment, about what kind of relationship Ukraine should have with NATO. But there's also a big push to strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense agenda. And Javier touched on that. And it connects to broader debates about investment, innovation, resilience, and so on. And all this without losing sight of other priorities. We heard about the South, we heard about China and AP4 and other global priorities. So to walk us through NATO's agenda and give us a better sense of what's at stake at Vilnius, we've got a great panel. To my immediate right, we've got Rachel Ellehus, who is the U.S. Secretary of Defense's representative in Europe and defense advisor at the U.S. mission to NATO. To my immediate left, I've got Gedrimas Gedlinskas, who's an associate expert with the Eastern Europe Studies Center, EESC, in Lithuania, and also former NATO Assistant Secretary General, by the way. Max Bergman, on my far right, who's director of the Europe Program and the Stewart Center at CSIS in Washington, and Sarah Kersberger, who is the head of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy and Security at the University of Kiel in Germany. So each of the speakers will take the floor for some introductory remarks, and after that, we'll open this up for any questions or comments you may have. Let's maybe start with Rachel and a U.S. perspective. Rachel, how do you assess, as defense advisor, NATO's adaptation to the challenge of strategic competition, which is probably the overarching theme in the strategic concept? And also specifically, how do you assess NATO's ability to balance the immediate need to support Ukraine and strengthen deterrence in the East with other strategic priorities, including the need to preserve stability in the South? Great to have you here, by the way.
Thank you. It's really great to be here and see former colleagues and to see the nexus of CSIS and Elcano as a former CSISer myself. So it's great to see colleagues here. I think our speakers did a great job laying out how full the agenda is for Vilnius and how much we already accomplished at Madrid. And before I answer your question, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that it really is almost emblematic that we're going from Madrid to Vilnius. If you look back to the 90s and the 2000s, I know a lot of our, allies on the eastern flank were sounding the alarm about Russia, and nobody was really listening. The alliance was very much focused on out-of-area operations. Spain was at the spearhead of a lot of those contributions. So it's wonderful to hear that we've learned that we really do need to take this 360-degree approach. So, what your minister just laid out about the NASAMS in Estonia, the enhanced forward presence contributions in Latvia, the Black Sea air policing, that is really what we're looking for from all allies. So just taking a moment to reflect on how we really are united, not just in rhetoric, but also in practice. In terms of the U.S. perspective, I think from where I sit, the NATO strategic concept and the agendas for both Madrid and Vilnius are extremely well aligned with the national defense strategy. The U.S. national defense strategy talks about allies and partners as central to implementation of our U.S. priorities, and those two priorities are very much aligned. The first is that Russia is the most immediate near-term threat. That's in the U.S. national defense strategy and in our strategic concept. And then this idea that, while maybe not an immediate military threat to NATO, China is a strategic competitor that is creating challenges in the transatlantic space, but also in its own neighborhood in a way that has implications for international rules and order. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of how NATO and the US are addressing strategic competition. Another area of overlap, if I reflect on what Javier said, is innovation. A lot of you probably track that the US has a lot of sort of innovation hubs, and the Pentagon in particular is trying to get a lot better about how quickly it can field and procure not just big conventional systems, but also more cutting-edge types of technologies. That's very much aligned with the Diana Initiative and the NATO Innovation Fund. So NATO, too, is looking at how creatively the Ukrainians have used the military equipment and the technology that they've been given, and really thinking that that is the way that we will be fighting in the future. So we're trying to really leverage that. Maybe then just to turn to what you asked about the South, because I do think on the face of it, this audience might look at the changes that are happening in NATO with the plans and the force structure and the command and control and think it's all about the East. But in fact, the way NATO is reorganizing itself and modernizing the way it does collective defense is really to the benefit of the entire alliance. So, if we kind of start with the plans, and this is a great opportunity for me and others to practice our sales pitch and make sure that we can convey to you the significance of these plans. So as our previous speaker said, NATO's just developed 7 domain-specific plans, but also 3 new regional plans. And this is exciting because for the first time, there will be forces aligned with those plans. Allies will come in and they'll pledge different capabilities and forces. Some of those forces will be for the South, some of those will be for the North Atlantic, and some of those will be for sort of Central Europe and continental Europe. And the reason that's exciting is because over time, that will drive capability choices of allies, and it will make better use of in-place forces. And so when we look at the NATO capability targets and we're telling allies what they should invest in, there's going to be more of a nexus and an overlap between what you're buying for your national security and regional security and what you're doing at that NATO level. And the command and control will sort of mirror those capabilities and forces. So it's really exciting to have on-the-shelf plans that give us, real high-level strategic plans that will then be translated at the Joint Force Command level to something implementable with forces and capabilities behind them. And it will also be a multi-domain approach. I think we can't underestimate that. There are a lot of tools in the cyberspace, the information space, the economic space that NATO can draw on, working closely with the European Union and individual countries to create dilemmas for our adversaries. So this is really how NATO's thinking about it. And if we turn to the South, there will be a plan, one of these plans, that is specifically aligned to the South. There will also be a rapid reaction force, an allied reaction force, that will still be capable of responding to out-of-area challenges. So the Very High Readiness Task Force that you may have known previously is not going away. But like what Javier laid out, it's going to move to a different format. It will have higher requirements in terms of readiness. So it's yet another example of how the alliance is able to focus on collective defense from a state-based threat while still keeping an eye on terrorism and other non-state challenges, many of which manifest themselves in the South. We're having a lot of conversations now about partners. I know the previous speakers spoke about it. Really sitting at the table with the partners to hear how NATO's partnership with them is working or not. There are even calls to realign the way NATO does partnerships to be more functionally focused. Right now we go country by country, but maybe we should say, all right, here, pushing back on disinformation is the top priority. Here, addressing the instability created by migration and Wagner Group is the problem. So really revamping those partnerships also to take account of new changes like the intersection between climate and security. Thinking about new areas like countering threats to critical undersea infrastructure. We've already had an example of that in the north with the Nord Stream pipeline attacks, but that can certainly happen anywhere across NATO's AOR. And so at Vilnius, I think you'll see a focus on NATO's role in monitoring and deterring those types of attacks and trying to build resilience. So again, just a few examples of things that are going on in the South and how we're trying to balance what is a lot of activity going on. And I think the final point I make is that, you know, Ukraine has really taught us about the links between various theaters. You'll hear a lot of people at the North Atlantic Council now speak of a one theater approach, that increasingly we can't bifurcate and say there's sort of a transatlantic space and there's an Indo-Pacific space and whatnot, that, you know, when NATO is assisting Ukraine, there are adversaries in the Indo-Pacific that are looking on and drawing lessons from that, whether positive or negative. So it's really important for NATO to stay the course, not just to prevent conflict from spreading within Europe, but to send a message to those who want to challenge the territorial integrity of other countries, or the rules-based order, or inhibit freedom of navigation. What we're doing for Ukraine really matters and has a broader significance. And when you look at the countries that sit around the table at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, that's 54 countries. It's allies, it's partners, it's Europeans, it's Indo-Pacific nations. And as the Deputy Minister mentioned, we are also going to have Indo-Pacific partners around the table at Vilnius. But it's really important to send this signal that what happens in one theater really, really matters. So there's not just a north, south, east, west of NATO that's blending together, but really a confluence of the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic space. And I know we're short on time and we want time for questions, so I'll pass it back to you.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. That's super useful. And thank you in particular for that analysis of the different plans and how they relate to forces, to tasks, to the different tasks of the alliance and to theaters. I think that was very useful. And thanks also for working the South into your remarks. As you know, this is very important for Spain. Let's maybe now turn over to Gedrimas. I was hoping you could tell us specifically about NATO's support for Ukraine and the challenges and opportunities you see in that context. There's been a lot of debate around that on the road to Vilnius, but also to get your take on NATO's deterrence agenda in the East more broadly. Well, welcome to Elcano.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Luis, and great to be here among so many great friends and former colleagues. Now, I no longer represent NATO nor Lithuanian government. I'm a citizen, so I can speak freely, somewhat freely, and of course, huge respect what NATO does. It's an incredibly important, relevant organization. I think first I want to say, to echo what Javier has said, that NATO has been able to carve out a role for itself in this conflict, and that's not a small feat. This is really, when the whole thing started, you know, we went into mode 24/7. We're going to be continue working all day, all night. This is a long-term fight. You know, with time, it sort of dissipated. Okay, NATO is not part of the conflict, and that was a really, really hard part to acknowledge, both, I think, among the delegations and the staff and the Secretary General's office and so forth. But I'd like to approach this with slightly differently with one question. One question is, has the war opened our eyes? And if so, are those eyes remain open to the real, the horrors of the threat that we're facing as Europeans, as a North Atlantic community? And I would say, I have really four comments really, but I'd say yes, there's a lot of great things that we've done after the war started. So yes, defense, I think everybody mentioned defense spending is up. We're all committed to continue to raising it. The first week of war, we saw the about face of it in the German kind of establishment on the defense spending. Many NATO allies have agreed to go gradually much faster towards the 2%. Now that 2% perhaps will be a floor even. Now, yet, I would argue that the spike in defense spending, in the commitments to defense spending, remains too gradual and probably too insignificant when you look at the threat that we're facing. I think Poland is leading the way now. They're doubling it to, close to 5% of GDP. They're leading the way. But everybody else, we're still kind of meddling in that 2% role. Now, again, coming from Lithuania, what does the 2% even mean? To us, I think, my argument, again, I'm not with the government nor with NATO, we have to spend whatever it takes to make sure that we remain safe and secure. So that 2%, yes, again, and it's not a rule. I agree with Ambassador. It would be great to have a rule 2%, but we know that NATO cannot impose that. This is sort of like a minimal viable product sort of in this environment. So 2% will be a recommendation, and then of course, but let's look at the numbers now. Only 7 out of 31 actually spend 2 or more percent of GDP. So again, I think Asia has shown a great example. Japan will be doubling its defense spending in 5 years. Australia is already also there with their nuclear submarine program. So when Asia takes it, they just go all in at it. I think we're still not there as the alliance, as the countries. So I think this is something that really needs some urgency to kind of to follow at NATO. Second is, I think we talk a lot about NATO's relevance has been reestablished. Fully agree. We have rediscovered our purpose. As Sekjan used to say, Putin wanted to divide NATO, actually unite it. He wanted to weaken us, actually strengthen us. True. That's very true, and I think that kind of unity has not been seen since probably 9/11. So that's a good thing. Yet, I think relevance is also it's a matter of time frame where you are. Relevance can stop the next day after you declare you're relevant. So it's always what's next. So yes, we've done this, we've done that. We're helping Ukraine. We're very. Not too much we're helping as alliance. I think the nations are doing it through the Ramstein Group, through other initiatives. But again, NATO remains sort of on the sidelines of that. Now, I would argue that the future really depends how we're able to defend those who want to get who want to continue to be part of or to become part of the club of the free nations. And because they face extermination, they face genocide. These are existential security problems that are at the periphery of Europe. So I think, and also without probably NATO's membership, I would say Ukraine's, and with that, Europe's long-term security would remain a distant dream. So again, to stay relevant, I think we need to look at the bold decisions in the future. So whether that's in Vilnius or in Washington, D.C., which is next year, some kind of path for Ukraine, and I agree with Ambassador here, is needed. And we cannot avoid that. 3, I think we're working on strengthening the eastern flank. We talked, both Javier and David spoke about the strengthening of the eastern perimeter. That's great. I think the transformational approach from deterrence, kind of forward deterrence to forward defense, that's absolutely key. Yet, as somebody from Lithuania, from very eastern part of the alliance, I would say that this is probably is barely sufficient. Let's remember 2014 or 2016 in Warsaw when EFPs, Enhanced Forward Presence Groups, has been established. It's been a major victory. We lauded process that we're building these battalions now. They're going to create a deterrence effect on the Russians in a 4 kind of Baltic states and Poland, and a TFP tailored forward presence in the more southern countries. Now, I think when you look now, these things get old very, very fast. We understand that battalion-sized units, it's nothing really when you see what's happening in the real front. So again, we have to continue to move forward, whether it's a brigade or whether it's more. Whether it's really station troops, it has to be some sort of permanent rotational presence, as Ambassador has said. So again, don't get me wrong. Well, EFPs are crucial to that, but it's far from sufficient. I think when we're looking at what's happening in Ukraine. But again, I think it's all about defense plans that are sort of underpin that planning, but also the resources. That's at the end of the day, we're going to hit that wall at some point. 4th, I think the red lines of our Ukraine have been falling on a monthly basis, which is a good thing. Now, I think from a critical point of view, I would say, and a lot of Ukrainians saying, well, why didn't those red lines fall faster? And that comes to play, of course. Again, it's less about NATO, it's more about NATO countries who have those resources, who have the assets that are needed for Ukraine. Now, so, I think to kind of summarize my little spiel, NATO has done a lot. Secretary General's leadership has been stellar in communicating. He's been consistent on the message. He's been vocal. He's been bold. I think that's exactly what's needed. Now, I think it's about urgency and clear idea of threats, that we really need to do much things faster and at higher scale and speed. So things that were needed. And I think Vilnius is offering that opportunity. Highly unlikely we're going to get there in all of these things that we mentioned, I think, but some progress hopefully takes place. I'll stop here.
All right, thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to the whole Ukraine-NATO relationship conversation. But your last point is a great segue, because Max has been doing quite a bit of thinking and writing on transatlantic burden sharing, particularly as it relates to capabilities, with a recent report that hopefully you'll tell us all about now, but also industry. So it'd be great if you could share your views about NATO's defense investment pledge and innovation efforts, but more broadly, the whole link between investment, innovation, and burden sharing, specifically in a post-Ukraine context. Great to have you in Madrid, by the way.
Great. It's great to be here, Luis, and thanks to Elcano for having me and for NATO for hosting this event. I'm going to start maybe with a little anecdote, because the State Secretary mentioned Amari Air Base, and in 2015, when I was in the State Department, I was a staffer to a senior leader, and I did very bad staff work, because we arrived in Tallinn at the hotel, and we were planning on going to Amari Air Base to meet an F-22 squadron, and there in the hotel was basically the F-22 squadron leaving town with their suitcases in the lobby ready to leave. And I thought, oh my God, who are we going to meet with? And then when we went to Amari Air Base later that afternoon, there was a Spanish Eurofighter squadron, and we had a great meeting with the Spanish officers there. And it was sort of a real sign of what NATO is all about, that here's a country, Estonia, that has no air force, that is dependent on other countries, on other European countries in the United States and Canada, to ensure its airspace. And here's Spain, very far, Mediterranean country, very far from home, in the cold of April in the Baltics, doing Baltic air policing and protecting Estonian airbase. So I think that was sort of a testament to NATO, and has always sort of struck with me of the importance of the alliance. But to your question, and as sort of the benefit of being not in government and from the think tank space, we always try to find different angles that maybe provide some new way to kind of think about current challenges. I think what has been outlined today has sort of demonstrated the kind of breadth of what NATO has done in response to the war in Ukraine. I would say what sort of concerns me as I look ahead is that I think what's clear is there's going to be significant amount of European investment in defense in the years ahead. One concern I have is that over the last decade, we have seen a decline in European defense cooperation when it comes to how Europe spends money. And if you have more than 25 countries sort of marginally spend a bit more on defense, but do so in an uncoordinated manner, you're going to have a marginal impact. The impact will not be transformational. And so this is where I think it's fundamental that we sort of reprioritize defense investment, cooperation, coordination. And this, I think, is one of the most challenging aspects of military cooperation. I can't imagine the Pentagon cooperating with other countries on defense procurement in the way that I think it's important for European countries to do so, just given the bureaucratic challenges. But this, I think, is something that the alliance needs to prioritize. I think it's something the United States needs to prioritize. And in part, I think this also points to a role for the European Union to play with some of the initiatives that it is now throwing out there, with the ASAP plan to buy ammunition, which is an Estonian initiative, I think makes a lot of sense, as does the DERPA, which is a great EU acronym about coordinating EU investment. But I think all of this requires a lot of money to incentivize the cooperation that's necessary. When I think we're seeing, with the Leopard program, for instance, the importance of European countries operating the same platform, and the potential that provides for European forces to work together and provide assistance. The other thing I would say is I think it is time, and this may be happening at NATO, Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong, and others can as well, but the U.S. focus on the Indo-Pacific, on the threat posed by China, is becoming all-consuming, essentially, in Washington. You can feel the sort of gravitational pull. We're all becoming China experts, because if you don't say anything about China, you're not able to say anything. So what that means, I think, is that and I respect the kind of concept of this being one theater, but I think there are certain practicalities in which the U.S. military is facing what the Pentagon has described as a pacing threat, the pacing challenge, a near-peer adversary, and it is very concerned about being able to match those capabilities. So there's potential for the U.S. military to be stretched, and I think it is important for us to take that into account when we think about European security and European defense investments. So are there critical things that the United States military provides that in an Indo-Pacific contingency may not be here in Europe? And I think those are the sort of redundancies that we need to think about. And I think one of the challenges from a U.S. government perspective is the instinct, and I can say this is not being in government, is to always reassure, to show that we will be indispensable. And I think that's the goal, that's the objective, but there's also competing challenges. So I think that is something for us to, for the alliance to sort of really grapple with. Maybe just a final point on Ukraine. On Ukraine, I think, look, NATO membership, I think, would be fantastic. I think we can look at the challenge of bringing Sweden in and realistically say that there's going to be a lot of difficulties to bring Ukraine in as a permanent member of NATO. I think the most important tangible thing is that we are funding the Ukrainian military in a very short-term way, because we are allocating money and then getting that money out the door. That is what the United States is currently doing, where we're providing a ton of military assistance that is rapidly going to Ukraine, so we are drawing down that assistance. What we haven't done is really figure out what is the long-term plan to rebuild the Ukrainian military, because no matter what happens with this counteroffensive, even if it completely fails and all the equipment that's provided gets destroyed, well, guess what? Ukraine will need more funding, it will need more equipment in order to deter a future Russian offensive. It will have to rebuild its forces no matter what. And I think we need to start thinking a bit longer term, and this is where the Israel model, the US-Israel model sort of comes into play, where the United States every year provides $3.5 billion of assistance to Israel. And what that does for the Israelis is allows them to make long-term strategic plans. What does the Israeli military want to look like? Well, they know that they'll have this money every year. They can, $35 billion over 10 years. They can make certain plans. We're going to buy this number of aircraft. We're going to buy this number of tanks. They can go out and make those acquisitions. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to start thinking about for Ukraine more practically, and that's what I hope Vilnius is able to deliver. And that involves, frankly, not just the United States. I hope we're going to be a very reliable partner to Ukraine in 2025, but I'm pretty sure Europe will be, that there's, in some ways, the political unity in Europe is now sort of, we don't talk about that much, but it's remarkable that across parties, across countries, there's real support. So I think having real long-term European defense financing commitments for Ukraine is going to be very crucial, and I hope that's something that is reckoned with at Vilnius.
All right, thanks. That's a big idea. I'm sure we'll come back to that, and perhaps Rachel may want to react to some of your previous points. But before that, let's turn over to Sarah. Sarah, let's maybe try and zoom out and put what's happening in Ukraine and Europe in a broader geostrategic context, and Rachel already touched on that. As you know, over the last few years, China's space in NATO conversations has been expanding. And Javier also touched on that. I'm just wondering how the war in Ukraine has shaped the way in which China is perceived in NATO circles, and perhaps amongst Europeans, more specifically, right? But also how you see the China, you've been doing a lot of work on the China-Russia relationship, so how do you see that relationship going forward, and what does that partnership mean for NATO, concretely?
Yeah, thank you, Luis. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to Elcano for hosting this panel. As a China specialist, of course, it's a good idea to attack some of these questions that you just mentioned. And I would like to start by saying that I think China's role in this Ukraine war needs to be seen as part of this triangle, Russia, China, Ukraine. It's not that China is an outside party of sorts, neutral, as it tries to portray itself. In reality, there's a long-standing Chinese-Ukrainian relationship, too, that gets overlooked often a little bit, and that I think tends to taint the assessment of China's actual behavior in this war. So let me just mention a couple of facts. Pre-2014, Ukraine was actually one of the most decisive helpers of China's military build-up. So if you look at what the Chinese Navy is fielding now in terms of aircraft carrier battle groups defended by destroyers that can conduct air defense around an aircraft carrier and has jets flying from those aircraft carriers, all of these key systems actually came originally from Ukraine. So the first model of a jet that could start from a carrier that came from Ukraine. The phased array radar systems that you need to conduct air defense to create an Aegis-like combat system came from Ukraine. The carrier itself, the first carrier, came from Ukraine. And the gas turbines that are powering Chinese destroyers, they come from Ukraine. So that was pre-2014, but it has left a huge legacy, you could say, of indebtedness in China. So where is the gratitude for that now, in a time of existential crisis? So Ukraine, on its part, has never done anything to threaten Chinese interests or betray its obligations. And there's also a treaty codifying these obligations. In December 2013, China and Ukraine concluded a friendship cooperation treaty. And one of its articles, Article 7, clearly says that if there is a grave threat to the territorial integrity of either party, these governments need to have immediate consultations to try and alleviate the threat. China has actually rejected any attempts by the Ukrainian government to hold consultations for more than a year after the war started, let alone before the war. So China is in breach of that, has been in breach of that treaty, and is definitely not neutral. It's supportive of Russia, not even calling this a war, and its so-called peace plan seems geared towards preserving the Russian territorial gains that it has made so far. So make no mistake, this is not a neutral position. On the Russia-China relationship, one could say China has also been trying to point out that it has supposedly been ignorant of the Russian war plan, had no part in it. I have some trouble believing that, because just a couple of weeks before the war started, in early February, Xi Jinping and Putin together proclaimed this new stage in their no-limits friendship. And I believe if Russia had never even notified China of its plan to invade, there would have been a little bit of surprise and even feeling of having been betrayed by one's best buddy, by being left in the dark about such a consequential maneuver that has a lot of impact on China as well. But there was not just zero surprise. China immediately started parroting the Kremlin lines about the war and the causes of the war, blaming NATO for the war, in fact, and so on. So zero surprise. There are other indications that I cannot go into in detail now, but there's very little credibility to that. And I would say what worries me a bit about this Russia-China trajectory is that the rapprochement between these two countries that have been at each other's throats throughout much of the Cold War actually began to intensify in 2008 with the attack of Russia against Georgia. Basically, from the moment Putin's Russia started to choose violence frequently as a tool in its international relations, that was the moment when the Xi Jinping, at the time it was still Hu Jintao, but from 2012 it was Xi Jinping, governments started to get closer to Russia. So there's a commonality there in terms of viewing violence as somehow a legitimate tool in international relations. So the annexation of Crimea in 2014 yet further intensified the Russia-China relationship. And it seems very much driven from the top. So it's a thing that Xi Jinping and Putin have both worked to cultivate. And the question is, of course, what would happen to it if either of these, or even both, were no longer in their positions. We cannot know that for sure. Right now, as a consequence of this failed, quick surgical strike on Ukraine that Russia probably anticipated, finding itself in this mess of a protracted war, Russia sort of finds itself in reduced circumstances with regard to China. So it has lost a lot of standing and respectability. And there are signs of increasing Chinese frustration and irritation since actually the summer of last year. So there's a dynamic at work there. But make no mistake, on the 22nd of March in this very year, more than a year after the war, we know that Xi Jinping said to Putin, because they were like accidentally filmed during this little informal exchange, he said, "We are driving a change that the world hasn't seen in the past 100 years, and it's we, both of us, that are driving it together." So that didn't exactly sound like enmity. One last point that I was asked to address is NATO's perception of China more broadly across the alliance. And that's actually interesting because there are so many diverging security cultures within NATO, within the NATO membership, that the issue of China, is China a partner, a rival, a threat, whatever, is one of the most, I think, divisive issues in terms of the threat perception across NATO. At one end of the spectrum are the Baltic countries and maybe the Czech Republic that see China very clearly as at least a challenge, if not a threat. Then we have countries like Germany that oscillate in some no man's land there. Spain, that seems relatively positively disposed towards more China engagement. And then we are at the extreme end, we have Hungary that is acting almost sometimes as a sort of a spoiler in the unity. I would add, from my point of view, as a citizen of both Finland and Germany, which is a pretty schizophrenic position to be in these days, that Russia versus China, which is the greater challenge for NATO, I think that question is looking at it from the wrong end. And I would not argue it's one theater. What I would argue is these two theaters, the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe, are interlinked. What happens in one influences what happens in the other. So whether we fully support Ukraine or not sends a signal to China, how far can I go? How easy will it be to drive a wedge into this alliance? So we need to consider the signaling purposes of everything that we do. So I would argue fully supporting Ukraine now serves the purpose of helping deter China against using force against Taiwan, for instance. So this would be my most important point to conclude these remarks with. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was great. Thanks to all four of you. So I know we are already in overtime territory, but if it's all right with our speakers, we're going to take a few more minutes to give you the chance to ask some questions or make some comments. So I'll just collect as many as I possibly can, then we'll go back to the panel in reverse order, and I'll give you like 2 minutes of glory to each to do a wrap-up. I see one question over there, one over here, one over there. That's 3, so let's stick to that. Please.
Hello, good morning. Ángel Villascusa, journalist at Cadena Ser Radio. I have a very straightforward question for Rachel. Are Ceuta and Melilla covered by the North Atlantic Treaty? And if they are not, are they covered by the new strategic concept? Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear I think the mic is up too loud, so there's a big echo.
Are Ceuta and Melilla, the 2 Spanish cities in northern Africa?
Are there two?
The 2 Spanish cities, enclaves in northern Africa. Ceuta and Melilla, are they covered by the
Okay, got it.
Yeah, thank you. We've got one over here, the 3rd row. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your interesting presentations and perspectives. I'm from the Embassy of Georgia in Madrid, Kate Sabauri, and I'd like to ask a question, please, to any of the speakers. We've spoken a lot about the threats and about the priorities, threats to NATO and priorities of the Vilnius summit. That was very interesting. I would like to ask you to just reflect a bit more on the Black Sea security, for example, and Georgia's role from the regional point of view in it, and what place it will have, Black Sea security among the priorities of Vilnius summit. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Black Sea security, I guess that's also more for Rachel. But anyone should feel free to jump in. Please. There's a mic coming your way. Yeah.
Hi, quick question. Recently we've seen photos of Bill Gates smiling with the Chinese leader and also Elon Musk celebrating his factories in China. So my question really is, it's more of an economic one, but as we know, show me your economic policy, I'll show you your foreign policy. If China is now an adversary and obviously a dictatorship, how long do you think public support will last if American firms are still allowed to operate and profit from a dictatorship which is funding an adversary across democratic states?
All right, thank you for that. So we have Ceuta and Melilla, we have Black Sea, and Bill Gates and Elon Musk. So that's an interesting combination. Do we have any final burning questions or comments? Yes, Miguel, please.
Thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. Really was very interesting. I'm Miguel Otero from the Elcano Institute. I do international political economy. And my question is to Max. It's very interesting what you say, and I fully agree that essentially we need to support Ukraine for the long haul. If Israel gets 3.5 billion, what are your calculations for Ukraine? How many billions do you think we need to give Ukraine over the next 10 years? Thanks.
Well, we should have seen that question coming.
I should have.
All right, I think we're gonna leave it at that. So as I said, we're gonna go in reverse order. You'll get a minute or two each. If some of the questions were not directed at you, you can either use the opportunity for final remarks or react to some of what the other speakers said, or otherwise you can also pass. Sarah.
Yeah, it's convenient that I have only one question to address about the economic entanglement, you could say. And you mentioned American examples, but there are a multitude of European examples, German car companies very prominently, for instance. And the problem that we have here is that China seems to put out incentives to create a lot of dependencies also in the supply chains, and then uses these dependencies in coercive diplomacy. And we have examples of that, and I know for a fact that also in Germany, these dependencies have been weaponized in private, government talks in terms of, we know where your car is parked, literally. So Lithuania is a country that can tell a tale of what happened when they opened that Taiwan office. And then, of course, China discovered that a lot of companies that actually are in the supply chain for German car makers that produce their goods within Lithuania can be informally sanctioned by just denying the products the customs procedure to enter the Chinese market, and thereby putting pressure on the government of Lithuania. It's a big mess. And I believe the only way forward is to make very clear from the government side to all of these companies, whether it's American, to say, we will not bail you out. You are entrepreneurs and you have to have a solid risk assessment. And if you put all your eggs in one basket, you're on your own. So draw the right conclusions from that and reduce your dependencies.
All right, excellent, thank you. Max?
Great. So maybe on the first question on Georgia and Black Sea security, I think obviously the Black Sea right now is not secure. Ukraine's ability, for instance, to access its ports, to export using the Black Sea is extremely curtailed by Russian military forces. There are Russian mines that are floating around, causing all sorts of havoc. I think this is a really critical challenge for NATO and the alliance, and something that I think Turkey in particular will need to be a productive NATO ally. When it comes to Georgia, I mean, Georgia is obviously a critical part of Black Sea security. But I think from a U.S. perspective, we would say one of the major challenges right now is is preventing Russia from getting many of the parts and components that it needs to keep its defense industry, its defense production lines going. And it is using all various countries, not simply Georgia, but Turkey, Central Asian countries, in order to, as routes to get in needed equipment. And I think that's an area for Georgia to focus on. I think that's an area that the United States and NATO is quite concerned about. And so I think Black Sea security in general is going to be an important issue, but I'm not sure how much progress is going to be made at the Vilnius summit. When it comes to American firms in China, I would just say, I think one thing that is happening, oftentimes you hear from Washington, and Washington is not New York. You know, we have our financial capital and our political capital are sort of separate, so Washington will be very eager to talk about decoupling, and New York a little bit less so. But I do think that what's happening is that and CSIS has done some work on this, talking to major U.S. companies that are seeing what's happening with executives being imprisoned and thrown in jail, and are becoming much more reticent. And that de-risking, I think, is a very real thing happening in the business world. And then when it comes to sort of the Elon Musk example of, Starlink, for instance, playing a critical role, this critical technology sort of being overseen by an American tech giant that is critical to Ukraine's security, I think that should raise some concerns within the alliance about being too dependent on various commercial actors. I will say that the United States also has an ability to nationalize defense industries. One of the reasons why Ford got its act together during World War II is there was a lot of concern that the U.S. government would come in and just say, we're taking this over. So that ability does exist. I mean, I'm not threatening Elon Musk. I don't work for the U.S. government, but I think CEOs are aware of that if their economic interests really run up against national security interests. So, and then how much Ukraine needs, I think that's frankly, that's really for the Ukrainians to answer. What I would say is that this isn't going to solve Ukraine's security situation. I think in some ways it's what can we provide, what can we afford to provide. I think that's quite a lot. But if you were to say, let's say, just take the Israel, 3.5 billion, make that over 10 years, what that does is enables Ukraine to go to defense companies and say, okay, we want to buy the Saab Gripen fighter jet. We want to buy 100 of them, that will cost $5 billion. Ukraine will say, well, we're going to have $35 billion over 10 years, so here's 5. Then you go and you look at your tracked vehicles or other critical expensive equipment, and you can start making these acquisitions because countries know it's not simply a one-year provision, it is a longer-term provision, and so you can, in some ways, buy off the future money, so you can make upfront purchases very quickly. So this is part of how Israel, how Egypt, and others have oftentimes operated with security assistance. One thing I should say is that it also means that if the US or Europeans are providing the money, that money goes back to European defense companies, because that's where oftentimes, well, at least we require the money to be purchased on US defense companies. Maybe just one quick point that I did not mention. I do think that when it comes to defense investment and all the money we're talking about and the 2% floor, it is very critical that at the EU level, that the Stability and Growth Pact negotiations don't limit that. And I think we're sort of divorcing the kind of security in economic conversations a little too much. You could argue the most important thing for the future of NATO is happening amongst EU foreign ministers or finance ministers, because if there's a focus on debt reduction, I don't see how Spain, I don't see how other countries over the next 10 years are going to hit 2%. And so I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. And the last thing, you teed me up for this, we sort of outline a lot of this in a new report at CSIS on really trying to encourage European defense cooperation.
Thanks. And again, a bold proposal on Ukraine assistance. Remember, you heard it here first. Gedrimas, over to you.
Yeah, just several points. Just to Max's point, also I'm affiliated with Atlantic Council, which is doing a lot of different works on various strands. And when we talk about the Israel model, so just to echo what Max said, the aid part is just probably quite a small part of the whole package. I don't think we can see, when we say Israel model, I think we see, we're going to do security guarantees like for Israel. But Israel is a nuclear power surrounded by countries which it had defeated before, it's a very different dynamic, and I don't think we can apply fully the kind of security guarantees aspect, but on aid, on support, I'm fully on. Now, on the kind of economic aspects, just to connect also what the Atlantic Council has done, they looked at the West. So Russian economy is about, was it 2-3% of global economy? That's a very different game from where China stands. Now, what is it, a year and a half from the start of the war, we calculated 17% of Western companies had left Russia. I think it's quite mind-boggling. I think that it's very hard to completely disconnect. And there are also various ways that Russia is using the networks of illegal, semi-legal, sort of their allied countries to import those goods that it needs. It's very hard to decouple. I think when we talk about China, that's the problem of a different scale. That's why I think you mentioned that it's less about almost decoupling. The wording now changing. Janet Yellen has said, well, it's not decoupling, it's actually de-risking now, right? So it's a long run sort of game. I think we'll see how it's going to play out. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Rachel, you have the last word.
Okay. So Ceuta and Melilla, I am 98% sure that it's covered by the North Atlantic Treaty. What the North Atlantic Treaty actually says is it's the North Atlantic area and territories above the Tropic of Cancer. So I think you're in the clear, but Americans are not very good at geography, so you might just want to verify that. But yes, I think the reason for that justification is you wouldn't want to have to be responsible for U.S. territories in Latin America or the Caribbean or UK and British territories further afield in Asia. But Ceuta and Melilla, I'm very, very close to certain they are covered. Black Sea will not be a focus of Vilnius, but it is a focus for NATO. And the United States. The U.S. has just, at the urging of Senator Shaheen, updated its interagency Black Sea strategy. As Max alluded to, a big part of it is about economic and humanitarian aspects rather than defense. As you can imagine, the picture in the Black Sea security and defense-wise is a bit complicated, given that Russia is a Black Sea partner, Turkey is in charge of the Montreux Convention, and there's a war going on. It's very complicated. But what we are trying to do from a NATO perspective is make sure that we have indications and warnings and that we have eyes on what's going on in the Black Sea so we can see if something similar to what happened to Ukraine would be happening to Georgia or Moldova. In the partnership lane, we're also trying to draw both of those countries closer to the alliance, so updating the partnership agreements and really trying to make it look a little bit more like NATO's partnership looked with Sweden and Finland, where we're sitting alongside each other and doing training and exercises and talking through defense plans. So how close can you get absent membership? Unfortunately, I think public opinion is not necessarily turning in NATO's favor in Georgia, and that's something they need to really pay attention to make sure that we don't slip any further, really need to be a bit more engaged. And then finally, I'll be like a politician and answer the questions that I wish I were asked. And that's just responding to two of Max's points, because I just want to reassure you that indeed the US and NATO allies are thinking about the capabilities that would likely be strained if the United States and any subset of European NATO allies would be pulled away into the Indo-Pacific. It's not so much a factor in land, but some of the air and maritime capabilities could come under strain. The interesting news is that it's the stuff we already knew were key capability shortfalls in a Euro-Atlantic context: airlift, refueling, ISR, and other combat enablers. But that is something that we have an eye to when we're really trying to think about where the priorities should be in the NATO defense planning process. And then likewise on Ukraine, although the focus is very much on the short-term assistance and really giving Ukraine as much lethal and non-lethal assistance as we can in the short term, in addition to the presidential drawdown aid that the U.S. has been giving, there's something called USAI, and everything that's given to Ukraine under USAI is actually meant to procure and sustain assistance for them for the longer term. So we're already having conversations about what that future force could look like. It was striking to me that Ukraine is the third largest army in Europe behind Russia and Turkey. They've got a mix of Soviet era and Western NATO interoperable equipment. So we really need to be thinking already now about how you mesh that into a coherent force. How do you make sure it's interoperable with NATO? How you make sure Ukraine has the money to sustain and maintain that equipment? And then on the humanitarian side, we have to think about some very practical things like demining and reconstruction together with the EU and other partners to make sure that Ukrainians can return and the economy can revive itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And let me reassure you that even though Georgia will not be covered specifically in the Vilnius summit, or rather the Black Sea, it's in excellent hands because Javier is the special representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia, so he can tell you all about that. But on a more serious note, apologies for going over time. I hope it was worth your time. It certainly was worth my time. I thought this was an excellent session. So I'd like to thank you all for your patience and for showing up and for your great questions and engagement, and our wonderful speakers. And please join me in thanking them for their time.